What if I told you that the ghost haunting my family's mansion wasn't some ancient spirit, but my own calculated revenge from beyond the legal grave? Buckle up because this story is about to take you on the wildest ride of betrayal, cunning, and supernatural justice you've ever heard. My name is Sarah, and 3 months ago, I was supposedly dead and buried while my greedy relatives threw the party of their lives, dividing up my inheritance like vultures picking at a carcass. But here's the thing they didn't know. I was very much alive, watching every single move they made, and I had spent 2 years planning the most elaborate revenge scheme that would make them believe they were living in their worst nightmare. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how I turned my family's greed against them, made them think they were going insane, and reclaimed everything that was rightfully mine while they begged me to stop the haunting that was actually just me pulling the strings from the shadows. Trust me, this isn't your typical ghost story. This is a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as a supernatural thriller, and I'm about to break down every single detail of how I pulled off the impossible. So hit that like button if you love stories of people getting exactly what they deserve. Subscribe if you want more wild tales of revenge, and let's dive into the most satisfying takedown you'll witness this year. Let me paint you the picture of how this whole mess started, because you need to understand just how deep this betrayal went before you can appreciate the beautiful chaos I unleashed upon my so-called family. My grandfather built the Whitmore estate from nothing, turning it into a sprawling mansion worth over $15 million, complete with secret passages, hidden rooms, and enough family history to fill a library. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left everything to me, his favorite granddaughter, who actually cared about preserving the family legacy instead of cashing it out for quick money, like my cousins Marcus and Elena, or my Aunt Rebecca, who saw dollar signs every time she walked through those marble hallways. But here's where things get really twisted, and I need you to pay attention, because this is where my family showed their true colors in the most disgusting way possible. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition that required immediate surgery, and during my recovery, I overheard my dear family members planning something that would make your blood boil. They were sitting in the very living room where my grandfather used to read me bedtime stories, casually discussing how they could have me declared mentally incompetent so they could seize control of my inheritance while I was weak and vulnerable from the surgery. Marcus, that snake in a designer suit, had already contacted lawyers about challenging my grandfather's will, claiming that I had manipulated an elderly man into changing his estate plans. Elena, who hadn't visited the mansion once in the 10 years before grandfather's death, suddenly became very interested in family history and kept asking invasive questions about my medical records and mental state. And Rebecca, the aunt who raised me after my parents died, was the mastermind behind it all, coordinating with financial advisors about how to liquidate the estate's assets as quickly as possible once they gained control. That's when I realized something that changed everything about how I viewed my family and what I was willing to do to protect what was mine. These people didn't love me, they didn't respect my grandfather's wishes, and they certainly didn't deserve a single penny of the fortune that was built through generations of hard work and sacrifice. So, I made a decision that would have made my grandfather proud and my enemies terrified. I was going to disappear completely, let them think they had won, and then systematically destroy their lives from the shadows while they celebrated their premature victory. The plan I developed over the next 6 months was so intricate and beautiful that I still get chills thinking about how perfectly every piece fell into place. First, I had to fake my own death convincingly enough that even the most suspicious relatives would believe it, which meant I needed help from people who owed me favors and had no loyalty to the rest of my family. My college roommate Jessica worked in hospital administration, and she helped me create false medical records showing that my condition had worsened dramatically, leading to a fatal cardiac event that occurred during a supposedly routine follow-up procedure. The fake death certificate was just the beginning, because I also needed to establish a completely new identity that would allow me to move freely around town without being recognized by people who had known me my entire life. I spent months studying makeup techniques, practicing different accents, and even had minor cosmetic procedures done to change my appearance, just enough that casual observers wouldn't connect me to the supposedly deceased Sarah Whitmore. Meanwhile, I was also installing hidden cameras throughout the estate, mapping out every secret passage and hidden room that my family didn't know existed, and preparing safe houses where I could retreat and monitor their activities without detection. But the most crucial part of my setup phase involved something that would make this revenge story truly legendary. I needed to make my family believe that my death had awakened something supernatural in the estate, something that was specifically targeting them for their greed and betrayal. This meant studying every family legend, every ghost story that had been passed down through generations, and every unexplained incident that had ever occurred in that mansion, so I could replicate and amplify those phenomena in ways that would terrify even the most skeptical person into believing they were dealing with genuine paranormal activity. The psychological research I did during this phase was intense because I needed to understand exactly how to manipulate each family member's specific fears and guilt complexes to maximum effect. Marcus had always been afraid of the dark and had recurring nightmares about being buried alive. Elena was terrified of mirrors and had superstitions about seeing spirits in reflective surfaces. And Rebecca had guilt about how she treated my mother before she died, making her susceptible to messages that seemed to come from beyond the grave. By the time I was ready to execute phase one of my plan, I had transformed from Sarah Whitmore, the grieving granddaughter, into something much more dangerous. I had become a phantom of revenge with the knowledge, resources, and motivation to make my family's worst nightmares come true. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling in secret, and my supposedly dead body was about to start the most elaborate haunting in family history. The funeral was absolutely perfect, and I watched every single moment of it from the hidden balcony above the main hall, recording their fake tears and hollow condolences while they secretly calculated how much money each crocodile tear was worth in inheritance dollars. Marcus wore his most expensive black suit and practiced his grief-stricken face in the mirror. Elena brought flowers that cost more than most people's rent just to show off for the other mourners. And Rebecca delivered a eulogy so full of lies about how much she loved me that I almost broke character and started laughing out loud at the sheer audacity of her performance. But the real show started 3 days after the funeral, when they all gathered at the estate for the will reading that they thought would make them instant millionaires. I had arranged for my lawyer to deliver some very interesting news. The will contained a clause that required all beneficiaries to live in the estate for 1 full month before they could claim their inheritance, and during that month, they had to maintain the property exactly as my grandfather had left it, with no changes or renovations allowed. You should have seen their faces when they realized they couldn't just sell everything immediately and walk away with their cash prizes. Marcus started pacing around the room like a caged animal, muttering about how inconvenient it would be to stay in the mansion for a whole month when he had business deals waiting in the city. Elena complained about the lack of modern amenities and how the old-fashioned decor was going to clash with her Instagram aesthetic. And Rebecca tried to find loopholes in the legal language, questioning whether the clause was even enforceable and threatening to challenge it in court. That's when I knew it was time to introduce them to their new supernatural roommate. And let me tell you, the first incident was absolutely spectacular in its simplicity and effectiveness. I waited until they were all asleep on their first night in the house, then used the secret passages to access Marcus's room, where I began playing recordings of my grandfather's voice, calling his name in disappointed tones, just loud enough to wake him up, but quiet enough that he couldn't pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Marcus stumbled around his room in the dark, turning on every light switch and checking every corner, but of course finding nothing because I was safely hidden behind a false wall that he didn't even know existed. The recordings continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes sounding like they were coming from the walls, sometimes from the ceiling, and sometimes from right behind his head, until he was so paranoid and sleep-deprived that he looked like he had aged 5 years in a single night. But I wasn't done with Marcus yet, because the next morning I left him a very special message that would set the tone for everything that followed. Using techniques I had learned from studying historical seances and spiritual communication, I arranged objects in his room to spell out words that only he would understand. Specifically, references to the shady business deals he had been involved in and the people he had betrayed to get where he was in life, along with cryptic warnings about how the dead remember everything and blood debts must be paid. Elena got her introduction to the supernatural world of the Whitmore estate through her greatest weakness, her vanity and obsession with mirrors and social media. I had installed special one-way mirrors throughout the house that allowed me to create the illusion of figures appearing and disappearing in reflective surfaces, and I spent hours perfecting the timing and positioning to make sure the effects would be both terrifying and seemingly impossible to explain through rational means. The first time Elena saw my ghost in the bathroom mirror while she was doing her elaborate skincare routine, she screamed so loudly that she woke up the entire household. But when Marcus and Rebecca came running to see what was wrong, there was nothing there except Elena pointing at her reflection and babbling about seeing a woman in old-fashioned clothing who looked exactly like me, but with hollow, accusing eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. Rebecca's haunting was the most personal and emotionally devastating because I knew exactly which guilt buttons to push to make her question her own sanity and moral character. I had saved recordings of my mother's voice from old family videos, and I used audio editing software to create conversations where my mother seemed to be confronting Rebecca about the way she had treated her daughter and granddaughter, asking why she had chosen money over family loyalty, and demanding justice for the betrayal that led to my supposed death. The psychological pressure I applied was relentless and escalating, with each family member experiencing phenomena that seemed specifically designed to target their individual fears and secrets while building towards something much bigger and more terrifying. I would move objects when they weren't looking, change the temperature in specific rooms to create cold spots that followed them around, and use hidden speakers to create whispers and footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. After 2 weeks of increasingly intense supernatural activity, my dear family members were starting to crack under the pressure, and watching their descent into paranoid madness was more satisfying than I had ever imagined possible during all those months of planning and preparation. Marcus had stopped sleeping entirely and was consuming dangerous amounts of caffeine and energy drinks to stay awake, convinced that the ghost was strongest when he was unconscious and vulnerable. Elena had covered every mirror in the house with sheets and towels, but she kept seeing my reflection in windows, picture frames, and even the surface of her morning coffee, until she was afraid to look at any reflective surface at all. Rebecca was the most affected by the psychological warfare because she knew deep down that she deserved everything that was happening to her, and her guilt was eating her alive from the inside while she tried to maintain the facade that she was just dealing with some unfortunate supernatural coincidence. She had started talking to herself constantly, having one-sided conversations where she would apologize to empty rooms and beg for forgiveness from spirits that she believed were judging her for her betrayal of family trust and loyalty. But the real masterpiece of my revenge plan was about to unfold, because I had been saving the best revelation for last, and it was going to be so shocking and devastating that they would never recover from the psychological impact of learning the truth about their supposed supernatural nightmare. I had arranged for all three of them to be in the main dining room at exactly midnight on the 15th day of their stay, using a combination of mysterious messages and eerie phenomena to guide them to that specific location at that precise time. The dining room was where my grandfather used to hold family meetings, and I had decorated it with candles, old family portraits, and personal items that belonged to deceased relatives, creating an atmosphere that was both nostalgic and terrifying, depending on your perspective and guilty conscience. I had also set up a sophisticated sound and lighting system that would allow me to create the most dramatic reveal possible, complete with special effects that would make Hollywood movie producers jealous of my technical skills and creative vision. When they were all seated around the antique dining table, looking terrified and exhausted from 2 weeks of supernatural terrorism, I began the final phase of my plan by using hidden speakers to play a recording of my own voice, speaking to them as if I was communicating from beyond the grave. But this wasn't just any generic ghost message. This was a detailed confession of everything I knew about their betrayal, their plans to steal my inheritance, and their complete lack of genuine grief about my supposed death. The look on their faces when they heard me reciting verbatim conversations they thought were private, quoting from emails they thought were secure, and revealing secrets they thought were buried forever, was worth every sleepless night I had spent planning this elaborate scheme of psychological revenge. Marcus went completely white and started hyperventilating. Elena began crying hysterically and apologizing to the empty air, and Rebecca collapsed into her chair, looking like she had seen the actual face of divine judgment. But I wasn't finished yet, because the real shock was still coming, and I had saved the most devastating revelation for the very end of their supernatural nightmare. As they sat there in terror, listening to my disembodied voice catalog their sins and demanding justice for their betrayal, I slowly emerged from the hidden passage behind my grandfather's portrait, very much alive, and very much in control of everything that had been happening to them for the past 2 weeks. The moment of recognition was absolutely priceless, and I wish I could bottle that expression of horror, confusion, and dawning realization that washed over their faces when they understood that everything they had experienced was not supernatural at all, but rather the calculated revenge of someone they had thought was safely dead and buried. Marcus actually fainted and had to be revived with cold water. Elena started screaming accusations about how I had faked my own death and terrorized them for entertainment, and Rebecca just stared at me like she was seeing a demon that had crawled out of her worst nightmares. I explained everything to them in calm, measured tones, detailing exactly how I had discovered their betrayal, planned my fake death, and orchestrated every single supernatural incident they had experienced during their month of hell in the estate. I showed them the hidden cameras, the secret passages, the audio equipment, and all the other tools I had used to create their personalized haunting experience, proving that their guilty consciences and psychological manipulation could be just as powerful as any real ghost story. The final twist of my revenge was the legal bombshell I dropped on them as they sat there processing the magnitude of what had just happened to them and how completely I had outsmarted their attempts to steal my inheritance. During my months of preparation, I had been working with investigators and lawyers to document their conspiracy against me, and I now had enough evidence to have them prosecuted for attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and elder abuse for their plans to have me declared mentally incompetent while I was recovering from surgery. 6 months later, and justice was absolutely perfect. Marcus got 18 months in prison and lost his entire business empire when the scandal broke. Elena went from influencer to retail worker, living in a tiny apartment, while her followers moved on to less controversial content creators. Rebecca received 3 years and has to pay massive restitution. But the real punishment is knowing she destroyed the last relationship that actually mattered for money she was never going to get anyway. As for me, I'm living my best life in grandfather's mansion, which I've turned into a foundation helping families deal with inheritance fraud and elder abuse. My book about this whole experience became a bestseller, and every penny goes to supporting people who've been betrayed by their own relatives during vulnerable times in their lives. The cameras are still rolling, by the way, just in case any other family members get bright ideas about challenging my inheritance or testing my limits. Once you've pulled off the greatest revenge story in family history, people tend to think twice before crossing you again. This is Sarah Whitmore, reminding you to protect yourself from people who love what you have more than who you are, and never underestimate what someone's capable of when you push them too far. If you loved this story of revenge and justice, smash that like button, subscribe for more wild tales of people getting exactly what they deserve, and remember, sometimes the best way to deal with betrayal is showing them exactly what they lost when they chose greed over love.